I was lying in a hospital bed at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, tubes running through my arms, my right leg held together by titanium rods and prayers, when I got the call that shattered what was left of my heart. After 3 tours in Afghanistan, after the IED that nearly took my life, after the 18-hour surgery that saved my mangled leg, my mother's voice on the other end of that satellite phone was colder than the morphine drip keeping me conscious. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Veronica, honey, we've talked about it, and we just don't think we can make the trip right now. Your father's back is acting up, and you know how he gets with flying, plus the expense. We're sure you understand. My name is Veronica Thorne, and from wherever you're watching this, I need you to stay with me. Because what I'm about to tell you is about the moment I realized that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will find every excuse in the world to abandon you when you need them most. And sometimes, strangers become the family you never knew you deserved. Have you ever sacrificed everything for people who wouldn't cross the street to save your life? I had just survived an explosion that killed 2 of my closest friends, Staff Sergeant Amy Rodriguez and Corporal Tyler Banks. We were on a routine patrol outside Kandahar when our Humvee hit an improvised explosive device buried in the road. Amy died instantly. Tyler made it to the helicopter but didn't survive the flight to base. I was the lucky one, they said. Lucky to be alive. Lucky to still have both my legs, even if one was held together with enough metal to set off airport security for the rest of my life. But as I lay there in that sterile German hospital room, listening to my mother explain why a plane ticket was too expensive and my father's mild back pain was more important than visiting their daughter who'd nearly died serving her country, I realized luck had nothing to do with it. This was just who they were, and I was finally seeing it clearly. Let me take you back to the beginning, before the explosion, before the betrayal, before I understood just how alone I really was in this world. I grew up in the small town of Millbrook Springs, Ohio, population 3,847, where the biggest excitement was Friday night football and the annual Corn Festival. My parents, Robert and Linda Thorne, ran the local hardware store that Robert's father had opened in 1962. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. We were what people called comfortable, which in Millbrook Springs meant you could afford to eat out at the Dairy Queen once a week and take a vacation to Cedar Point every summer. Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. But comfortable didn't mean loving, not in the Thorne household. My father was a man who measured affection in practical terms. Love was keeping the lights on and food on the table. Emotional support was telling me to toughen up when I cried about kids picking on me at school. When I graduated valedictorian of my high school class, he said, "Good. At least all that studying paid off." When I told him I'd received a full scholarship to Ohio State University, he nodded and said, "Well, that'll save us some money." My mother was softer around the edges, but no less distant. She existed in my father's shadow, agreeing with whatever he said, echoing his sentiments in gentler tones. When I needed comfort, she'd make hot chocolate and tell me things would work out, but she never actually did anything to make them work out. She was a bystander in her own family, watching life happen to her rather than participating in it. And me, I was the daughter who tried too hard, the one who brought home perfect grades hoping for praise that never came, the one who played 3 sports, joined every club, volunteered at the church and the animal shelter, all desperately seeking some sign that I mattered to them, that I was more than just another mouth to feed and responsibility to manage. When I turned 18 and announced I was joining the Army, the reaction was exactly what I should have expected. "Why would you do that?" my mother asked, her hands fluttering nervously around her coffee cup. My father was more direct. "Seems like a waste of a good education, but it's your life to screw up." They didn't understand that I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward it, toward purpose, toward people who might actually value what I had to offer, toward a place where my efforts might be appreciated, where my sacrifices might mean something. I was wrong about a lot of things back then, but I was right about finding purpose. Basic training at Fort Benning was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the most rewarding. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who pushed me to be better not because they were disappointed in who I was, but because they believed in who I could become. Drill Sergeant Patricia Hayes saw something in me that my own parents never had. She saw a leader. "Thorne," she told me during week 8 of training, "you've got something special. Don't waste it." I didn't. I excelled in advanced individual training, scored in the top 5% on every evaluation, and was selected for military intelligence. The Army became the family I'd always wanted. My unit became my brothers and sisters. My commanding officers became the mentors I'd always needed. And through it all, I tried to stay connected to home. I called my parents every Sunday, sent postcards from every base, mailed photos from every deployment. When I made specialist, I called home excited to share the news. My mother said, "That's nice, dear. Your father wants to know if you're still planning to use your GI Bill for college when you get out." When I was promoted to sergeant, I flew home on leave to surprise them. They were polite, but distant, asking more questions about my benefits and future plans than about my experiences or achievements. I spent that entire week trying to connect with them, sharing stories about my unit, about the work we were doing, about the people I'd met, and the places I'd seen. They listened with the same enthusiasm they'd show for a grocery store clerk describing produce prices. It was during that leave that my father made a comment that should have told me everything I needed to know about how they really saw me. We were sitting on the back porch after dinner, watching the sunset over the cornfields behind their house. I was telling them about my friend Amy Rodriguez, how she was from a big Mexican-American family in Texas who treated me like their own daughter whenever I visited, how her mother, Rosa, had taught me to make authentic tamales, and how her father, Miguel, had insisted I call him Papa Miguel because, as he said, any friend of Amy's is family to us. My father listened to the story and then said, "Sounds like you found yourself a new family. Good thing, since you're never here anyway." The words hit me like a physical blow. I tried to explain that I was thousands of miles away, serving our country, that I missed them, that I wanted to be closer, but my duties came first. He just shrugged and said, "Like I said, you made your choice." That was the moment I realized they didn't see my service as sacrifice. They saw it as abandonment. In their minds, I hadn't left home to serve something bigger than myself. I had left home because I didn't want to be around them. And maybe, deep down, they weren't entirely wrong. But I kept trying. I kept calling. I kept sending money when they mentioned the roof needing repair or the car needing new tires. I kept believing that eventually they'd see that everything I was doing was, in part, for them, to make them proud, to honor the values they'd raised me with, even if they'd never actually articulated what those values were. My second deployment to Afghanistan was when everything changed. Our unit was stationed at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, just outside Kandahar. The mission was intelligence gathering and support for local infrastructure projects. The IED was buried about 6 inches under the road, positioned perfectly to hit the driver's side of our vehicle. The explosion was so powerful, it flipped our armored Humvee completely over. The last thing I remembered before losing consciousness was the smell of burning metal and the sound of Amy screaming my name. I woke up 18 hours later in a German hospital, missing 3 weeks of memory and facing a rehabilitation process that would take months. The doctors told me I was lucky. The word felt like a joke. Amy was dead, Tyler was dead, and I was lying in a hospital bed with a leg full of titanium, trying to understand how I was supposed to feel lucky about any of this. The first call I made was to my parents. I had to call through the Red Cross because I couldn't remember their phone number or much of anything else from before the explosion. When they finally got through to me, I was barely coherent, heavily medicated, and desperately needing to hear familiar voices telling me everything was going to be okay. "Mom?" I whispered when she answered. "Mom, I'm hurt. I'm in Germany. There was an explosion." The silence on the other end lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. "Veronica? Oh my God, are you okay? Are you going to be okay?" I tried to explain what the doctors had told me. Multiple fractures, internal injuries, traumatic brain injury, months of physical therapy ahead. I was crying, something the medication made difficult to control, trying to tell her how scared I was, how much I needed them. "We'll figure out how to get there," she said. "Your father and I will figure something out." For 3 days, I held on to that promise. Every time a nurse came in, every time a doctor checked on me, every time another patient's family visited, I told them my parents were coming. They were figuring it out. They'd be here soon. Then came the call that broke me. "Veronica, honey, we've talked about it, and we just don't think we can make the trip right now. Your father's back is acting up, and you know how he gets with flying. Plus the expense." The expense. I was lying in a hospital bed, having survived an explosion that killed my 2 closest friends, facing months of rehabilitation and possible permanent disability, and my parents couldn't afford a plane ticket to see me. "How much?" I asked. "How much does it cost?" "Well, it's not just the flight. It's hotels and food, and your father would have to close the store for at least a week." I did the math in my head, even through the medication fog. Less than $3,000, total. For both of them. I had more than that in my checking account, money I'd saved from deployment pay since there wasn't much to spend money on at FOB Phoenix. "I'll pay for it," I said. "I'll pay for everything. Please. I need you here." Another silence. Then, "Veronica, we don't think that's a good idea. You need that money for when you get out of the hospital. We'll see you when you get stateside, okay? The doctors say you're going to be fine." Fine. I was going to be fine. I hung up and stared at the ceiling for 2 hours before I started crying. Not the medication-induced crying from earlier, but deep, body-shaking sobs that brought nurses running. They couldn't understand what was wrong, why my vitals were spiking, why I was suddenly in such distress. How could I explain that my parents had just told me I wasn't worth a plane ticket? That after nearly dying for my country, after losing my best friends, after facing months of pain and uncertainty, the people who brought me into this world couldn't be bothered to show up? That's when Sarah Mitchell walked into my life. Sarah was a representative from the Wounded Warrior Project, one of dozens of volunteers who visited military hospitals around the world to check on wounded service members. She was about 50, with graying hair and kind eyes, and she had a way of talking that made you feel like you were the most important person in the world. "Staff Sergeant Thorne, I'm Sarah from the Wounded Warrior Project. I heard you might like some company." I was embarrassed to be caught crying, tried to wipe my face and compose myself. "I'm fine," I said, the lie falling flat even to my own ears. Sarah pulled up a chair next to my bed and sat down like she had all day to spend with me. "You know, I've been visiting wounded warriors for 8 years, and I've never met one who was actually fine. You want to tell me what's really going on?" And for some reason, I did. I told her everything. About my parents, about their refusal to visit, about feeling abandoned and alone in a foreign country while recovering from the worst trauma of my life. I told her about Amy and Tyler, about the guilt I felt for surviving when they didn't, about not knowing how I was going to face going home to people who clearly didn't want me there. Sarah listened without interrupting, without judging, without offering empty platitudes. When she finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Veronica, I want you to know that you're not alone. Not now, not ever. The Wounded Warrior Project isn't just about medical support and benefits assistance. We're about family, and you're part of our family now." She wasn't just saying it to be nice. Over the next 6 weeks of my recovery in Germany, Sarah visited me every other day. She brought books and magazines, helped me video call other wounded warriors who were further along in their recovery, connected me with resources I didn't even know existed. But more than that, she brought other volunteers, people like Dr. James Patterson, a retired Army colonel who'd been wounded in Iraq and now spent his time mentoring younger veterans through their recovery, like Maria Santos, a former Navy medic who taught art therapy to help process trauma, like David Kim, a Marine veteran who'd lost his arm in Afghanistan and now worked as a peer counselor. These people, these complete strangers, became the family my own parents couldn't be bothered to be. When I was stable enough to be transferred to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Maryland, Sarah made sure I wasn't traveling alone. She arranged for Dr. Patterson to accompany me on the flight, ensuring I had medical support and someone familiar nearby during the journey. At Walter Reed, the Wounded Warrior Project's support continued. They helped me navigate the complex medical system, connected me with the best physical therapists, and most importantly, introduced me to other wounded warriors who became some of my closest friends. My parents did eventually visit me at Walter Reed, once. For 3 hours, on a Sunday afternoon. They stood awkwardly in my hospital room, making small talk about the weather and asking when I thought I might be back to normal. My mother brought flowers from the grocery store and a card that said, "Get well soon," in generic script. My father spent most of the visit looking at his watch and asking about parking validation. When they left, my mother hugged me briefly and said, "We're proud of you, honey. Call us when you get out." They were proud of me the way you're proud of a neighbor's kid who makes the honor roll. Distant. Obligatory. Meaningless. But as I watched them walk away, I realized something had shifted inside me. Their abandonment still hurt, but it didn't define me anymore. I had found something they couldn't give me and couldn't take away. A chosen family that valued me not for what I could do for them, but for who I was. The Wounded Warrior Project didn't just help me heal physically. They helped me understand that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about showing up when someone needs you. Sometimes it's about loving people not despite their broken places, but because of them. And as I land that hospital bed at Walter Reed, surrounded by cards and flowers from people who'd known me for weeks rather than years, I started to understand that my parents' refusal to visit me hadn't been my greatest loss. It had been my greatest liberation. Because now I knew the difference between people who claimed to love you and people who actually showed up. And I was about to discover just how powerful that knowledge could be. 3 months into my recovery at Walter Reed, I discovered something that would change everything. Not through some dramatic revelation or lucky accident, but through a conversation with my financial counselor that started as routine paperwork and ended with me understanding just how much power I'd been sitting on without even knowing it. Janet Holloway was a civilian contractor who worked with wounded warriors to help manage their benefits, insurance claims, and financial planning during recovery. She was methodical, thorough, and had a way of explaining complex military bureaucracy in terms that made sense. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m., she'd sit with me in the hospital's administrative office and walk through the endless forms and documentation required for my medical retirement process. "Veronica," she said during one of our sessions, pulling out a thick folder with my name on it, "we need to discuss your beneficiary arrangements and power of attorney designations. Some of these documents haven't been updated since you first enlisted, and given your current situation, we should make sure everything reflects your current wishes." I nodded, expecting the usual questions about life insurance and emergency contacts. But as Janet spread the paperwork across the table, something caught my eye that made my stomach drop. There, in black and white on a form I'd completely forgotten about, were my parents' names listed as my financial power of attorney and primary beneficiaries for my military life insurance policy. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was the dollar amount listed next to their names. $400,000. "Janet," I said, pointing to the number, Is that current?" She glanced at the document and nodded. "Yes, that's your current SGLI benefit amount, Service Members Group Life Insurance. It automatically increases based on your rank and years of service. You're currently covered for $400,000, with your parents listed as primary beneficiaries." My mouth went dry. "And the power of attorney?" She said, "That gives them authority to make financial and medical decisions on your behalf if you're incapacitated. It was probably set up when you enlisted. Pretty standard for single soldiers who list their parents as emergency contacts." I stared at those documents, my mind racing. My parents, who couldn't afford a $3,000 plane ticket to visit their wounded daughter, stood to inherit $400,000 if I died. My parents, who had shown exactly zero interest in my medical care or recovery, legally had the power to make medical decisions for me if my condition worsened. What would have happened, I asked slowly, if I hadn't woken up from the explosion or if I'd been in a coma? Janet's expression grew serious. "Your parents would have become your legal guardians, essentially. They'd control your medical care, your finances, your benefits, and if you had died," she gestured to the insurance form, "they would have received the full benefit amount." The room felt like it was spinning. I thought back to that phone call, to my mother's voice explaining why they couldn't visit. "The expense, your father's back is acting up. You understand." Meanwhile, they were sitting on paperwork that could potentially net them nearly $500,000 if something happened to me.
But then Janet said something that made me realize I wasn't as powerless as I thought I was.
Of course, you can change any of this at any time. You're mentally competent, you're an adult, and these are your decisions to make. A lot of wounded warriors reassess their beneficiaries and power of attorney arrangements during recovery. It's actually pretty common. I can change it? All of it? Absolutely. You can revoke their power of attorney immediately and designate new beneficiaries for your life insurance. You can also designate who gets your disability benefits, your military pension, everything. It's your life, Veronica. Your choice who gets to be part of it. That night, I lay in my hospital bed staring at the ceiling, processing what I'd learned. My parents hadn't just abandoned me in my moment of greatest need. They'd abandoned me while holding legal and financial power over my life that they'd never mentioned, never discussed, and apparently never felt obligated to exercise in my actual best interest. I started making phone calls. The first call was to Sarah Mitchell from the Wounded Warrior Project. I explained what I'd discovered and asked if she could recommend a military attorney who could help me understand my options. "Veronica," Sarah said, her voice careful but supportive, "I want you to think about this carefully. Changing beneficiaries and power of attorney is absolutely your right, but it's a big decision. Are you doing this because you're angry or because you genuinely want these arrangements to be different?" It was a fair question, and I gave it serious thought before answering. "Sarah, if something happens to me tomorrow, I want the people who get my benefits to be people who actually cared about me while I was alive. I want medical decisions made by people who understand my values and what I'd want. My parents have shown me exactly who they are. I believe them." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Okay, I'll connect you with Captain Lisa Hayes. She's a JAG officer who specializes in helping wounded warriors with legal issues. She's good people." Captain Hayes came to see me 2 days later. She was probably in her early 30s, sharp-eyed and direct, in a way that reminded me of my drill sergeant. She sat down with my file and listened while I explained the situation. "Staff Sergeant Thorne, what you're describing is actually more common than you might think. Young soldiers often list their parents as beneficiaries and power of attorney without fully understanding what that means. Then life happens, relationships change, and suddenly those arrangements don't reflect the soldier's actual wishes anymore." "So I can change it? All of it?" "You can change all of it today if you want, but I want to make sure you understand the implications." She pulled out a legal pad and started sketching out options. "Revoking power of attorney is straightforward. We can do that immediately, and you can designate someone else, or leave it revoked and make your own decisions." "What about the life insurance?" "You can change beneficiaries, but there's a waiting period before changes take effect. Military regulations require a 30-day processing period for SGLI beneficiary changes. So if you change it today, your parents would still be the beneficiaries for another month." I nodded. "And if I wanted to designate the Wounded Warrior Project as my beneficiary instead?" "Perfectly legal. Charitable organizations can be SGLI beneficiaries. Or you could split it, part to WWP, part to other organizations or individuals you care about." That's when the idea started forming. Not just changing my beneficiaries out of anger or spite, but creating something positive from this situation. Something that would honor Amy and Tyler, help other wounded warriors, and ensure that if something happened to me, the money would go to people who actually made a difference in veterans' lives. "Captain Hayes," I said, "what if I wanted to set up something more complex, like a trust or foundation?" Her eyebrows went up. "That's possible, but it would require additional legal work. Why don't you tell me what you're thinking?" I explained my idea. Instead of simply changing my beneficiaries out of anger or spite, I wanted to create a legacy fund for wounded warriors. Money that would go to organizations like WWP, to scholarships for veterans' children, to support programs for families dealing with military trauma. I wanted Amy and Tyler's names attached to it, so their sacrifice would be remembered and would continue helping people long after we were all gone. That's
Actually brilliant, Captain Hayes said, and it's absolutely doable. We'd need to set up a trust structure, designate trustees, outline the charitable purposes. It would take some time to set up properly, but it's definitely possible. How long? Maybe 6 weeks to 2 months to get all the legal documentation in place, but we can revoke your parents' power of attorney immediately, and we can file the preliminary beneficiary change paperwork to show your intent while we're setting up the trust. That afternoon, I signed the papers revoking my parents' power of attorney. It felt like taking a deep breath after holding it for years. Suddenly, every medical decision, every financial choice, every aspect of my recovery was mine to control. No one else could make choices about my life without my explicit consent. But I didn't stop there. I started researching what else I could control that I never thought about before. My military records, for instance. I discovered that I could designate who had access to my service records, my medical information, my awards and commendations. I could control who the Army notified about my condition, my progress, my eventual discharge. I'd been assuming my parents automatically had access to information about my military service, but it turned out that wasn't true. I could cut off their access entirely if I wanted to. My benefits were another area where I had more control than I realized. My disability compensation, my medical benefits, even my eventual GI Bill education benefits. I could designate who inherited those if something happened to me, or I could ensure they went to specific programs or organizations instead of defaulting to next of kin.
Then I discovered something even more interesting. My parents had been receiving family notification updates about my condition, not detailed medical information, but general updates about my status, my progress, my expected timeline for recovery. This wasn't because they had any legal right to that information, but because I'd never told the Army to stop sending it. I could cut that off, too. It was like discovering I'd been living in a house where other people had keys, and I just realized I could change all the locks. But the most powerful discovery came when I was talking to Maria Santos, the art therapy volunteer from WWP who'd been helping me process my trauma through painting and sketching. "Veronica," she said during one of our sessions, "have you thought about sharing your story? I mean, really sharing it, publicly?" I looked up from the watercolor I was working on, a landscape of the mountains visible from my hospital window. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your story about your parents, about WWP stepping in when your family wouldn't. It's powerful. It's exactly the kind of story that shows people why organizations like ours matter. But more than that, it shows other veterans that they're not alone when their families let them down." I'd never thought about my experience as something that might help other people. I'd been so focused on my own pain, my own recovery, my own anger at my parents, that I hadn't considered that other wounded warriors might be dealing with similar family abandonment. "You think other people go through this?" Maria nodded. "More than you'd think. Not every family knows how to handle having a wounded warrior. Some families rise to the occasion and become incredible support systems. Others don't. They get scared or overwhelmed, or they just can't handle the reality of what their soldier has been through. So they pull away right when their loved one needs them most. And those soldiers end up feeling like I did, abandoned and alone." Exactly. But your story shows that there's another way, that chosen family can be just as powerful as biological family, that organizations like WWP aren't just providing services, we're providing love, support, the thing that families are supposed to provide but sometimes can't or won't. That's when it hit me. The real power I had wasn't just legal or financial, it was the power of my story, the power to show other wounded warriors that they weren't alone, that family abandonment wasn't their fault, and that there were people and organizations who would show up when their blood relatives wouldn't. But more than that,
I realized I had the power to publicly illustrate the difference between organizations that actually support veterans and families who only support them in theory. My parents had spent years telling people in Millbrook Springs about their daughter, the soldier. They'd put my military photo on the mantle, mentioned my deployments at church, basked in the reflected glory of having a child in the service. But when it mattered, when I actually needed them, they'd found excuses to stay away. The Wounded Warrior Project, on the other hand, had shown up for a complete stranger, simply because I was a wounded warrior who needed support. I could use that contrast. I could tell that story in a way that would not only help other veterans, but would also show my parents, and anyone else who needed to see it, what real support looked like. Captain Hayes finished the legal paperwork for my trust fund 6 weeks later, the Rodriguez Banks Thorne Foundation for Wounded Warriors, named after Amy, Tyler, and me. If something happened to me, my $400,000 life insurance benefit would go directly to the foundation, which would provide emergency support for wounded warriors whose families couldn't or wouldn't help them during recovery. But I also added a clause that Captain Hayes thought was particularly clever. The foundation would send annual reports to donors and interested parties, detailing exactly how the money was being used to support abandoned wounded warriors. My parents would receive those reports every year for as long as the foundation existed. They'd get to see, in detail, how the money they'd expected to inherit was instead going to help veterans whose families had failed them, veterans exactly like their own daughter. "Are you sure about this reporting requirement?" Captain Hayes asked as we reviewed the final documents. I smiled. It is designed to make a point. The point that actions have consequences. The point that when you abandon someone, you don't get to benefit from their sacrifice. And the point that there are people in this world who will show up for veterans even when their own families won't. I signed the final papers on a Thursday afternoon in November, almost exactly 8 months after the explosion that had changed everything. My parents were no longer my beneficiaries. They no longer had any legal authority over my life or medical care. They would no longer receive updates about my condition or progress. Instead, I'd created a legacy that would help wounded warriors for decades to come, managed by people who understood what real support looked like. But I wasn't done yet, because I'd realized something else during those weeks of legal planning and soul-searching. I had one more kind of power that my parents had never expected me to develop, the power of my voice. And I was about to use it.
The interview request had come through Sarah Mitchell, who'd mentioned my situation during a broader conversation with a producer about veteran family support issues. The producer, Jennifer Walsh, had been intrigued by the contrast between biological family abandonment and chosen family support, and wanted to explore it in a segment about veteran experiences. "We're not looking for a gotcha piece," Jennifer had assured me during our preliminary phone conversation. "We want to tell a story about resilience, about finding support in unexpected places, and about the real-world impact of veteran service organizations. Your story illustrates that perfectly." I agreed to the interview, but I had my own agenda. This wasn't just about sharing my story. It was about creating a public record of what had happened. A record my parents would eventually hear, along with everyone else in Millbrook Springs who knew them. The interview was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in December, exactly 9 months after the explosion. I wore my dress uniform, the same one I'd worn for my promotion ceremony 2 years earlier. The Purple Heart I'd received from my injuries was pinned to my chest, along with my deployment ribbons and service awards. Jennifer met me in the lobby of the radio station. She was younger than I'd expected, probably early 30s, with an energy that immediately put me at ease. "Staff Sergeant Thorne, thank you so much for coming in. I know this isn't easy to talk about. Please, call me Veronica. And actually, it is easy to talk about now. It took me a while to get here, but I'm ready to tell this story." We settled into the studio, and Jennifer began with background questions about my service, my deployment, the explosion that had wounded me. I answered factually, professionally, keeping my emotions in check. This wasn't about eliciting sympathy.
It was about establishing credibility. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. Veronica, can you tell us about your family's response when you were injured? I took a breath and told the story exactly as it had happened. The phone call from Germany, my parents' refusal to visit, the cost concerns, my offer to pay for their trip, their continued excuses. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Jennifer said, her voice carefully neutral. You were recovering from an explosion that killed 2 of your fellow soldiers, you were hospitalized in a foreign country, and your parents declined to visit because of the expense. That's correct. And you offered to pay for their travel. Yes. I offered to cover all expenses, flights, hotels, meals, everything. At that point, I just needed my family with me. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. How did that make you feel? At the time, it was devastating. I felt abandoned. I questioned everything about my relationships, my service, my worth as a daughter and as a person. I paused, letting that sink in. But it also led me to discover something incredible about the veteran community and organizations like the Wounded Warrior Project. That's when I shifted the narrative. I talked about Sarah's first visit, about Dr. Patterson and Maria Santos, about the network of chosen family that had formed around me during my recovery. I described specific examples of support. Sarah driving 3 hours to bring me books when I mentioned feeling bored, Dr. Patterson spending his entire weekend helping me navigate Veterans Affairs paperwork, Maria organizing art therapy sessions that helped me process my trauma. These weren't people who had any obligation to help me. They weren't family members or old friends. They were strangers who became family because they understood something my biological family didn't, that showing up for people in crisis is what love actually looks like. Then she asked about the foundation I'd established. I explained the Rodriguez Bank's Thorne Foundation, its mission to support wounded warriors who lacked family support, and how it was funded by my life insurance policy. So instead of your parents inheriting that money if something happens to you, it goes to help other veterans in similar situations. Exactly. Amy Rodriguez and Tyler Banks, the 2 soldiers who died in the explosion that wounded me, they both came from families who would have moved heaven and earth to support them if they'd been injured instead of killed. This foundation ensures that other wounded warriors get that kind of support even when their biological families can't or won't provide it. That's when Jennifer asked the question that allowed me to make my real point. Veronica, have your parents heard about this interview? Do they know you're sharing this story publicly? They will, I said simply. The foundation sends annual reports to all interested parties, including my former beneficiaries. They'll receive detailed information about how the money they expected to inherit is instead being used to help abandoned wounded warriors. Every year, for the rest of their lives. The interview aired 3 days later during morning drive time when it would reach the maximum number of listeners. Jennifer had edited it skillfully, letting my story speak for itself without editorial commentary. The segment was 17 minutes long and covered everything we'd discussed. Within hours, my phone was ringing. The first call came from my brother Danny, whom I hadn't spoken to in over a year. Roni, what the hell? Did you really just go on the radio and trash Mom and Dad? I was ready for this conversation. Danny, I told the truth about what happened. If the truth makes them look bad, maybe they should have made different choices. You know they couldn't afford to fly to Germany. Dad's business has been struggling and Mom's been dealing with her own health issues. Danny, I offered to pay for everything. They refused. And somehow they found the money to take that cruise to the Caribbean 6 weeks after I was wounded. Silence. He hadn't known about the cruise.
Also, I continued, they've been receiving my life insurance money as beneficiaries without ever mentioning it to me. $400,000, Danny. They stood to inherit $400,000 if I died, but they couldn't manage a $3,000 trip to see me when I almost did die? That's different. That's insurance. Insurance they never told me about. Power of attorney they never discussed with me. Medical decision-making authority they never mentioned having. How is that different? Danny struggled to respond. Finally, he said, look, I get that you're hurt, but did you have to make it public? This is going to humiliate them. Good, I said, and meant it. Maybe humiliation will help them understand how their actions affected me. Maybe other families will hear this and think twice before abandoning their wounded warriors. The second call came from my mother, predictably. Veronica, how could you do this to us? Everyone's calling, everyone's asking questions. Mrs. Henderson from the church called to ask if we'd really refuse to visit you in the hospital. What did she tell her? I told her it was complicated, that there were things she didn't understand. Mom, it's not complicated. You chose not to come. That's it. That's the whole story. We couldn't afford it. I offered to pay. You said no. We didn't want to be a burden. But you were fine being beneficiaries of my life insurance policy without telling me about it. Another silence. Then, quietly, how did you find out about that? It doesn't matter how I found out about it. What matters is that you knew about it and never mentioned it. You had legal authority over my medical care and never discussed it with me. You were getting updates about my condition and recovery, but couldn't be bothered to visit or even call regularly. Veronica, please, can't we work this out privately? Do you have to keep making this public? Mom, I tried to work it out privately for 3 months. I called, I wrote letters, I begged you to be involved in my recovery. You chose not to be. So now I'm working it out publicly. What do you want from us? It was a fair question, and I'd given it a lot of thought. I want you to understand that actions have consequences. I want you to think about what it means to abandon someone when they need you most. And I want you to leave me alone while I build a life with people who actually care about me. The third wave of calls came from people I hadn't expected. Other veterans, family members of wounded warriors, and journalists who'd heard the radio interview. A reporter from the Columbus Dispatch called to ask if I'd be willing to do a follow-up story for their Sunday magazine. A producer from CNN reached out about featuring my story in a segment about veteran family dynamics. 3 different wounded warriors called to share their own stories of family abandonment and to ask about the foundation. But the most impactful call came from Rosa Rodriguez, Amy's mother. Mija, she said, her voice warmed despite the sadness in it. I heard your interview on the radio. Someone sent me the link. I hadn't expected Amy's family to hear about this, and I was suddenly worried they might feel I was exploiting their daughter's memory. Mrs. Rodriguez, I hope it's okay that I mentioned Amy in the interview. I wanted people to know what kind of person she was, how important she was to me. Oh, Mija, of course it's okay. Amy would be so proud of what you're doing. She always said you were the strongest person she knew, even when you didn't see it yourself. Rosa was quiet for a moment, then continued, You know, when Amy died, we were surrounded by family and friends. The whole community came together to support us. But you were lying in a hospital bed, hurt and alone, and your own parents wouldn't come to you. That's not right, Mija. That's not how family is supposed to work. The Wounded Warrior Project became my family. People like Sarah and Dr. Patterson and Maria, they showed up when my blood family wouldn't. Good, Rosa said firmly, and now you're making sure other soldiers have that same support. Amy would love that. She always worried about the soldiers who didn't have strong families backing them up. Mrs. Rodriguez, would you consider being on the Foundation's advisory board? I think Amy would like knowing her mom was helping make decisions about how to support other wounded warriors. I heard her crying softly. I would be honored, Mija. I would be so honored. Tyler's grandmother, Dolores Banks, called the next day with a similar message of support. Within a week, I had both women committed to serving on the Foundation's board, ensuring that Amy and Tyler's families would have direct input on how the money was used to help other veterans. But the real impact of the radio interview became clear when the hate mails started arriving. Not hate mail directed at me, hate mail directed at my parents. People had looked up Robert and Linda Trone in Millbrook Springs, Ohio. They'd found the hardware store, the church my parents attended, even their home address.
and some listeners had decided to share their opinions about parents who would abandon a wounded daughter. I learned about this when my father called, angrier than I'd ever heard him. Veronica, you need to stop this. People are...
For the first time in this entire process, I heard something in his voice that might have been genuine remorse. But it was too little, too late, and it was motivated by public embarrassment rather than actual understanding of what they'd done to me. Dad, I'm not destroying you. I'm telling the truth about what happened. If that truth is uncomfortable for you, then maybe you should have made different choices 9 months ago. What do you want us to do? How do we fix this? You don't fix this, Dad. You live with it. The same way I had to live with being abandoned by my parents when I almost died serving my country. I hung up and immediately called Captain Hayes to make sure my legal protections were still in place. I wanted to ensure that my parents couldn't somehow challenge the foundation or try to reclaim beneficiary status by claiming I was acting out of spite or temporary emotional distress. Your paperwork is bulletproof, she assured me. You were evaluated by military psychologists, you had proper legal counsel, and everything was done according to regulations. They have no legal recourse. Good, because I have a feeling they're going to try. I was right. 2 weeks later, my parents hired a lawyer to explore their options for challenging my beneficiary changes. The lawyer, a small-town attorney named Gerald Moss, called Captain Hayes to inquire about the possibility of having my decisions reversed. Captain Hayes shut that down quickly and definitively. Mr. Moss, your clients have no legal standing to challenge Staff Sergeant Thorne's beneficiary designations. She was mentally competent when she made these changes, she had proper legal representation, and she followed all required procedures. They have no legal recourse. Good, because I have a feeling they're going to try. I was right. 2 weeks later, my parents hired a lawyer to explore their options for challenging my beneficiary changes. The lawyer, a small-town attorney named Gerald Moss, called Captain Hayes to inquire about the possibility of having my decisions reversed. Captain Hayes shut that down quickly and definitively. Mr. Moss, your clients have no legal standing to challenge Staff Sergeant Thorne's beneficiary designations. She was mentally competent when she made these changes, she had proper legal representation, and she followed all required procedures. They have no legal recourse. Gerald Moss apparently shared this assessment with my parents because I never heard from him again. But the public attention continued to grow. The Columbus Dispatch ran their feature story, which was picked up by several other Ohio newspapers. The CNN segment aired during a primetime special about veteran issues. Each new piece of coverage brought more calls from veterans with similar stories, more interest from organizations wanting to partner with the foundation, and more uncomfortable scrutiny on my parents. The breaking point came in February, almost a full year after my injury. A documentary filmmaker named Marcus Thompson reached out about featuring my story in a film about veteran family dynamics. The documentary would include interviews with me, with Wounded Warrior Project representatives, and potentially with other family members who were willing to participate. We'd like to offer your parents the opportunity to share their perspective. We believe in presenting multiple viewpoints, and this would give them a chance to explain their side of the story. I thought about this carefully. Part of me wanted to deny them that opportunity to ensure they couldn't use the documentary to rehabilitate their image or make excuses for their behavior. But another part of me was curious to see what they would actually say if given the chance to explain themselves publicly. You can ask them, but I won't pressure them to participate, and I won't change my story based on whether they agree to be interviewed. Understood. We want this to be authentic, whatever that looks like. My parents declined to participate in the documentary. They released a brief statement through their attorney saying they preferred to handle family matters privately and wished me well in my recovery. The documentary, titled Chosen Family: When Blood Isn't Enough, premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and later aired on HBO. My segment was about 20 minutes of the 90-minute film, but it was one of the most powerful sections. The filmmakers had done an incredible job of letting my story speak for itself while also highlighting the broader work of organizations like the Wounded Warrior Project. The night it aired on HBO, I watched with Sarah Mitchell, Dr. Patterson, Maria Santos, and about a dozen other wounded warriors who'd become my chosen family. We gathered in the common room at a veteran transition housing facility in Arlington, eating pizza and cheering every time one of our organizations was mentioned. "You know what this is?" Sarah said during a commercial break. "This is proof that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the most important thing you do." She was right. My parents' abandonment had been devastating, but it had led me to discover a strength I never knew I had. It had introduced me to people who became more family to me than my blood relatives had ever been. It had inspired me to create something that would help other veterans long after I was gone. But most importantly, it had taught me the difference between people who love you in theory and people who love you in practice. The difference between people who claim to support the troops and people who actually support individual soldiers when they're wounded and vulnerable. My parents had fallen into the first category. Sarah, Dr. Patterson, Maria, Rosa Rodriguez, Dolores Banks, and dozens of other people I'd met through this experience fell into the second. As the documentary ended and the credits rolled, I looked around at the faces of the people who chose to be my family. These were people who'd shown up not because they had to, but because they wanted to. People who'd proven their love through actions rather than words. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, I thought it might be my parents, finally reaching out after seeing the documentary. But it was from a wounded warrior in Texas whose family had abandoned her after she was injured by an IED.
The strategic phase of my plan was complete. My parents had been publicly held accountable for their choices. I'd created a lasting legacy that would help other wounded warriors. Most importantly, I'd learned to distinguish between people who deserved a place in my life and people who didn't. Now it was time for the final phase, building something beautiful from the wreckage of what I'd lost. 2 years after the HBO documentary aired, I was standing in the grand ballroom of the Marriott Marquis in Washington, D.C., wearing a navy blue evening gown and looking out at an audience of 500 people who had gathered for the second annual Rodriguez Banks Thorne Foundation Gala. The foundation that had started as a way to redirect my life insurance money had grown into something I never could have imagined. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, "please welcome the founder and executive director of the Rodriguez Banks Thorne Foundation, Veronica Thorne." The applause was thunderous as I walked to the podium, my gait still slightly uneven from the injuries that had started this entire journey. I looked out at faces I recognized, wounded warriors I'd helped, their families, Wounded Warrior Project staff, military leaders, and civilians who'd become passionate supporters of our cause. But the faces that mattered most to me were in the front row. Sarah Mitchell, who'd become not just my mentor, but my closest friend. Dr. Patterson, now the Foundation's chief medical advisor. Maria Santos, our art therapy program director. Rosa Rodriguez and Dolores Banks, who'd helped us distribute over $3 million in emergency support to wounded warriors whose families had abandoned them. 2 years ago, I began, I was a broken soldier lying in a hospital bed, feeling utterly alone in the world. Tonight, I'm standing before 500 members of my chosen family, celebrating the fact that no wounded warrior ever has to feel that alone again. The foundation had exceeded every projection we'd made during those early planning sessions with Captain Hayes. What had started as my personal response to family abandonment had become a national organization with chapters in 12 states. We'd helped over 800 wounded warriors with everything from emergency financial assistance to family mediation services. We'd funded 3 transitional housing facilities specifically for veterans whose families couldn't or wouldn't support their recovery. But the numbers, impressive as they weren't what made me proudest. It was the individual stories, like Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, whose parents had refused to modify their home to accommodate his wheelchair and who was now living independently in one of our accessible housing units while finishing his engineering degree. Like Corporal Jennifer Walsh, whose husband had filed for divorce while she was recovering from traumatic brain injury and who'd used our emergency support fund to hire a lawyer and keep custody of her 2 children. Like Staff Sergeant David Chen, no relation to the name I'd avoided using, whose parents had stolen money from his disability benefits to fund their gambling addiction, and who'd worked with our legal assistance program to regain control of his finances and press charges against them.
Each story reinforced what I'd learned during my own darkest moments, that family isn't about blood or obligation, it's about showing up when someone needs you most. The Rodriguez Banks Thorne Foundation exists because of a simple truth. Some families rise to the challenge of supporting a wounded warrior, others don't. For those warriors whose biological families fail them, we provide something better, a chosen family that understands what real support looks like. As I spoke, I caught sight of a familiar figure near the back of the ballroom. It took me a moment to place him, but then I realized it was my brother, Danny. He'd grown a beard and put on weight, but it was definitely him. He was standing alone, looking uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit, clearly unsure whether he belonged there. After my speech, I made my way through the crowd, accepting congratulations and posing for photos with donors and supporters. But I kept thinking about Danny's presence. He'd driven 5 hours from Ohio to be here, which meant this wasn't a casual decision. I found him on the hotel's outdoor terrace, smoking a cigarette and staring out at the Washington Monument. "Danny." He turned, startled. "Roni, hell of a speech in there. What are you doing here?" He took a long drag from his cigarette. "I've been following the Foundation's work, reading the annual reports, watching your interviews. I wanted to see what you'd built. And I'm proud of you. I'm also ashamed of myself. I'd imagined this conversation many times over the past 2 years, but now that it was happening, I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Danny, why now? Why come here instead of just calling? Because I needed to see it for myself. The people in there, the way they look at you, the things you've accomplished. Mom and Dad really screwed up, didn't they? Yeah, they did. And I screwed up too. I should have supported you when all this started. I should have come to see you in the hospital myself, even if they wouldn't. But you didn't? No, I didn't. I was a coward. I didn't want to deal with the drama or take sides or make things awkward with Mom and Dad. He flicked his cigarette into the darkness. I chose them over you, and I've regretted it every day since. I studied my brother's face in the dim light from the ballroom windows. He looked older, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. Danny, I forgave Mom.
Danny was quiet for a long moment. Last year, my son Connor broke his arm pretty badly in a skateboard accident, had to have surgery, spent 3 days in the hospital, and during those 3 days, I never left his side. I slept in a chair next to his bed, brought him books and games, held his hand when he was scared about the anesthesia. I could see where this was going. And the whole time, I kept thinking about you lying in that hospital in Germany, alone, scared, probably in more pain than I could imagine. And I kept thinking about Mom and Dad finding excuses not to come see you. It made me sick, Ronnie, physically sick. So you're here out of guilt. I'm here because I finally understand what family is supposed to mean, and I want to be the brother I should have been 3 years ago. I looked back through the windows at the gala, at all the people who'd become my real family. Sarah was talking to a group of donors, probably sharing stories about our programs. Rosa Rodriguez was hugging a young wounded warrior who just received one of our scholarships. Dr. Patterson was deep in conversation with a senator about veteran healthcare legislation. These people had shown up for me when I was nobody to them. They'd built this entire organization around the principle that every wounded warrior deserved support and love during their recovery. They'd proven that chosen family could be stronger than biological family. Danny, I appreciate you coming here. I appreciate you acknowledging what happened, but I need you to understand something. I don't need you anymore. I don't need Mom and Dad anymore. I've built a life and a family that works without any of you. His face fell, but I wasn't done. That said, if you want to be part of my life going forward, you can be, but it has to be on my terms. You don't get to waltz back in and pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. You don't get to skip the hard work of rebuilding trust. And you absolutely don't get to act as an intermediary between me and our parents. He understood. Do you? Because part of being in my life means supporting what I've built here. It means understanding that the Wounded Warrior Project and this foundation are my real family now. It means accepting that I'm never going back to Sunday dinners in Millbrook Springs pretending everything is fine. Danny nodded. I wouldn't want you to. What you've built here is incredible, Ronnie. It's more important than anything happening back home. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the traffic move along the Potomac. Finally, Danny spoke again. Can I ask you something? Do you ever think about what would have happened if they had come to Germany? If they'd supported you from the beginning? I'd thought about this question many times. Yeah, I do. And honestly, I think I would have come home, fallen back into old patterns, and never discovered what I was really capable of. I would have been grateful for scraps of attention from people who saw me as a burden. I never would have built this foundation, never would have helped all these veterans, never would have found my real family. So, in a weird way, their abandonment was the best thing that could have happened to you? Not the abandonment itself. That was devastating and cruel and unnecessary. But my response to it, yes. That became the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to discover who I really was and what I was really worth. Inside the ballroom, the band was starting to play, signaling the beginning of the evening's entertainment portion. Through the windows, I could see couples beginning to dance. I should get back in there, I said. Ronnie, wait. Before you go, I know this is probably presumptuous, but I brought something for you. Danny reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package. It was Amy's. Her mom asked me to give it to you. I was confused. Danny, you don't know Amy's mom. How would you have gotten something from Rosa Rodriguez? I called her last month. I wanted to understand what kind of family you'd found, so I reached out to some of the people mentioned in your interviews and articles. Rosa, Tyler's grandmother, Sarah from the Wounded Warrior Project. I told them I was your brother and that I was trying to understand how badly we'd failed you. This was not what I had expected to hear. They all agreed to talk to me, and they all said the same thing, that you'd found something with them that we'd never given you. Unconditional support, genuine love, pride in who you were, not disappointment in who you weren't. I unwrapped the package carefully. Inside was a small silver locket, tarnished with age. I opened it to find 2 tiny photographs, one of Amy in her military dress uniform and one of Tyler in his combat gear, both grinning at the camera. Rosa said Amy always wore this during deployments. She had pictures of her family in it originally, but when you 3 became so close, she put in photos of you and Tyler instead. She said Amy's real family was in her heart, not in her blood. Rosa thought you should have it. I felt tears starting to form. Amy had never told me about the locket, had never mentioned that she carried pictures of Tyler and I during our deployment. And Rosa also said something else. She said Amy used to talk about you all the time, about how strong you were, how much you'd overcome, how proud she was to serve alongside you. She said Amy always worried that you didn't see your own worth, that you didn't understand how much you meant to the people who really knew you. I closed the locket and held it against my chest.
Danny, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are you here because you genuinely want to be my brother? Or are you here because Mom and Dad sent you to try to rebuild some kind of relationship? They don't even know I'm here, he said immediately. They don't know I've been following your work or that I reached out to Rosa and the others. This is entirely my decision. And if I let you back into my life, you understand that it means choosing me over them when those choices come up. Roni, I've already chosen. The fact that I'm here tonight instead of at home pretending none of this ever happened should tell you that. I looked back at the ballroom one more time. Sarah had noticed I was missing and was looking around for me.
Dr. Patterson was checking his watch, probably wondering if I was okay. These people had become my security blanket, the family that never let me down. Okay, I said finally, we can try, but slowly and with clear boundaries. Danny's relief was visible. Thank you. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'll do everything I can to earn it. The first step is understanding that you're not just trying to earn a relationship with me, you're trying to earn a place in this family I've built. These people are everything to me now. I get that. And Roni, what you've accomplished here, the way you've turned something so painful into something that helps so many people, Amy and Tyler would be incredibly proud of you. We walked back into the ballroom together. Sarah immediately came over, looking relieved to see me. There you are! We were about to send out a search party. Sarah, I'd like you to meet my brother Danny. Danny, this is Sarah Mitchell, the woman who saved my life. Sarah extended her hand with a warm smile. Any brother of Veronica's is welcome here, though I have to say she's built quite a family of her own over the past few years. That's what I'm hoping to become part of, Danny said, if she'll have me. Over the next hour, I introduced Danny to Rosa Rodriguez, Dr. Patterson, Maria Santos, and several of the wounded warriors we'd helped through the foundation. I watched him listen to their stories, ask thoughtful questions, and begin to understand the scope of what we'd built. Near the end of the evening, as people were beginning to leave, Rosa pulled me aside. Mija, I'm glad your brother came tonight. Amy always said you deserved a family that appreciated you. I have that family now, I said, looking around at the people who'd made the foundation possible. Yes, you do, but that doesn't mean there's no room for one more, if he proves himself worthy. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the terrace again, this time with Sarah, looking out at the city where I'd rebuilt my life. Proud of what we've accomplished? She asked. Proud doesn't begin to cover it. 3 years ago, I was a wounded soldier who felt utterly abandoned. Tonight, I'm surrounded by family, I've helped hundreds of veterans, and I've created something that will outlast all of us. And your brother? We'll see. He says the right things, but I need to see if he follows through when it's difficult. Sarah nodded. You know, when I first met you at Landstuhl, I could see your strength, but I don't think even I imagined you'd become this kind of leader. I didn't have a choice. When your biological family abandons you, you either give up or you build something better. I chose to build. And look what you built. I thought about my parents, probably asleep in their small house in Millbrook Springs, still living with the consequences of their choices. I thought about Amy and Tyler, who would never get to see what their sacrifice had ultimately made possible. I thought about the hundreds of wounded warriors who'd found support and family through our foundation. Most of all, I thought about the scared, lonely soldier I'd been 3 years ago, lying in a hospital bed in Germany, feeling like the world had forgotten about her. You know what the best part is? I said to Sarah. That girl in the German hospital, the one who felt so abandoned and worthless, she was wrong about everything. She wasn't abandoned. She just hadn't found her real family yet. She wasn't worthless. She was exactly as valuable as she believed herself to be. And now? Now I know the difference between people who love you and people who claim to love you. I know the difference between family that's assigned to you and family that chooses you. And I know that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can become the foundation for the best thing you ever do. The foundation had grown beyond anything I could have imagined during those early planning sessions with Captain Hayes. We now had partnerships with major corporations, endorsements from military leaders, and a waiting list of wounded warriors seeking our services. But more importantly, we'd created something that would continue helping veterans long after I was gone. Danny proved himself over the following months. He volunteered at our Ohio chapter, helped organize fundraising events, and never once asked me to reconcile with our parents. He built relationships with Sarah, Rosa, and the others, not because he had to, but because he genuinely wanted to be part of what we'd created. On the 3rd anniversary of my injury, we held a memorial service for Amy and Tyler at Arlington National Cemetery. Danny was there, along with Rosa, Dolores Banks, Sarah, Dr. Patterson, Maria, and dozens of wounded warriors we'd helped through the foundation.
It was the first time I'd visited their graves since returning to the United States.
I placed flowers on both headstones and read them the latest Foundation annual report. We'd helped over 1,200 wounded warriors by then, distributed nearly $5 million in emergency assistance, and opened residential facilities in 6 states. Amy, Tyler, I said quietly, I hope you're proud of what your names have made possible. I hope you know that every veteran we help, every family we support, every warrior who finds hope when their own family fails them, it's all because of the friendship you gave me and the inspiration your sacrifice provided. Rosa placed her hand on my shoulder. They know, mija, and they're proud. As we walked away from the cemetery, Danny fell into step beside me. Ronnie, can I tell you something? Of course. I used to think family was about obligation, about showing up because you had to, staying loyal because of blood, making excuses for people's bad behavior because they were related to you. And now? Now I understand that real family is about choice, about showing up because you want to, staying loyal because someone has earned it, calling people out when they hurt someone you love. I smiled. Took you long enough to figure that out. Yeah, well, better late than never. As we drove back to the Foundation's headquarters in Arlington, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The explosion that had nearly killed me, the parents who'd abandoned me in my darkest hour, the strangers who'd become family, the legal battles and media interviews and public accountability. All of it had led to this moment, driving through Washington, D.C. with my chosen family, having created something meaningful from something painful. My parents still lived in Millbrook Springs. They still ran their hardware store, still attended the same church, still received the annual Foundation reports that showed them exactly how the money they had expected to inherit was being used to help the veterans they'd failed to support. I didn't hate them anymore. I didn't think about them much at all. They'd become irrelevant to my life, footnotes in a story that had grown much bigger than their abandonment. But I did think about Amy and Tyler every day. I thought about the scared young soldier I'd been in that German hospital. I thought about Sarah's first visit, Dr. Patterson's guidance, Rosa's maternal love, and all the wounded warriors who'd found hope through our foundation. Most of all, I thought about the truth I'd learned through this entire experience, that sometimes the people who hurt you most give you exactly what you need to become who you were meant to be. My parents' abandonment had taught me the difference between real love and conditional affection. It had forced me to discover my own strength. It had led me to build a family based on choice rather than obligation, and a legacy that would help veterans for generations to come. In the end, their greatest failure had become my greatest success. And that, I realized, was the most perfect justice of all.